voice on the line. The air was thick with an oppressive silence when Claire picked up the phone. The room was dimly lit, bathed in the soft glow of a single desk lamp, and the heavy curtains blocked out the world outside. Her fingers trembled slightly as she grasped the receiver, the familiar weight of it grounding her in the present. It was late past midnight, and the house was wrapped in a hushed stillness that only deepened the chill in her bones. The call had come unexpectedly, its insistent ring cutting through the quietude like a jagged shard. Claire glanced at the clock, its hands frozen at 12:17 a.m. She had been trying to forget, to move on. But the voice on the other end of the line seemed to reach across the years with an uncanny clarity. The voice that she had not heard for over a decade. "Hello," she ventured cautiously into the receiver. There was no immediate response, just the soft crackle of static that seemed to swallow her words. She could feel her heartbeat quickening, a relentless thudding in her chest that echoed the uncertainty gnawing at her. The line was eerily silent for a moment longer before a voice broke through, a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar. It was the voice of her brother, Daniel, who had died in a car accident years ago. The sound was so vivid, so unmistakable, that it seemed impossible. The tone, the cadence, the slight raspiness, it was all unmistakably Daniel's. Claire's hand gripped the receiver tighter, her knuckles whitening. Memories of Daniel flooded back, memories that she had tried so hard to bury. She remembered the way he used to laugh, the warmth of his presence, and the way he could make any room feel lighter just by walking into it. But now, that voice, that laughter, was coming from a place where it should not be. Panic surged through her, mixing with disbelief. How could this be happening? She had attended Daniel's funeral, seen the flowers, heard the eulogies. The finality of his death had been a crushing blow, a wound that had never quite healed. And now, this call, this impossible, terrifying call, was ripping open that old scar. The voice on the other end of the line was filled with a strange sort of desperation. It spoke in hushed, urgent tones, as if trying to convey something crucial yet elusive. Claire strained to make out the words, but the static seemed to blur them, making them almost indistinguishable. The seconds stretched into an eternity as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. The voice seemed to be pleading with her, but for what? There was a sense of urgency in the tone, a sense that something was terribly wrong, but the words themselves remained just out of reach. The static seemed to dance around the voice, making it difficult to focus. Claire's thoughts raced, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had to understand what was happening, why Daniel's voice was calling her from beyond the grave. It was a cruel trick, a horrifying jest, or something even more sinister. She had no idea, but she knew she had to find out. As the seconds ticked by, Claire's resolve hardened. She could not ignore this call, this ghostly echo from her past. She would have to confront whatever was behind this eerie communication. With a deep breath, she tried to steady her nerves, preparing herself for whatever revelations might come next. The voice, however, continued to linger in the static, as if waiting for her to decipher its haunting message. The second call came a week later, at the same time, 12:17 a.m. Claire had been trying to resume her normal life, pushing the unsettling encounter to the back of her mind. Yet, as soon as the phone rang, all her attempts to forget were shattered. The ringing was relentless, cutting through her fragile calm like a knife. She hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at the clock before picking up the receiver. The dim light of her bedroom seemed to cast longer shadows, as if the night itself was conspiring against her. The room was colder than usual, and she could see her breath misting in the chill of her own fear. As she lifted the receiver to her ear, her heart pounded with apprehension. The same crackling static greeted her, a harbinger of the eerie voice that had plagued her dreams since the first call. When the voice finally emerged from the static, it was as unmistakably Daniel's as it had been before. It was laden with the same desperation, the same eerie familiarity that had left her in turmoil the last time. This time, however, the words were slightly clearer, though still laced with static. "Claire," the voice whispered, almost like a secret carried on the wind. The utterance was soft and trembling, like a plea that had wandered through the corridors of time to reach her. Her name sounded like a distant echo from a past she was trying to leave behind. Claire's grip on the receiver tightened as she tried to decipher the meaning behind the message. The voice was tinged with an unmistakable sorrow, a depth of emotion that spoke of unspoken fears and untold stories. It was as if Daniel was trying to tell her something important, something that had remained hidden for years. The room felt as if it were closing in around her, the walls pressing in with an invisible weight. Claire's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation. The voice seemed to waver, as though struggling to maintain coherence through the haze of static. It was as if something was interfering, preventing a clear communication. She began to question her own sanity. Could it really be Daniel, or was her grief manifesting in these disturbing illusions? The thought was both frightening and maddening. She had been alone for years, her circle of friends and family dwindling, and now this haunting presence that defied all reason. The line remained open, the static a constant reminder of the call that had no clear resolution. Claire tried to keep her emotions in check, focusing on the voice and the fragmentary words it offered. The call ended abruptly, leaving her with more questions than answers. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the voice itself, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive quiet. The next morning, Claire tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it was a prank, a cruel joke played by someone who knew her past. She reviewed the phone records, but there was nothing unusual, no strange numbers or anonymous calls. It was as if the call had come from nowhere, a ghostly apparition on the other end of the line. Despite her attempts to dismiss the calls as figments of her imagination, the dread lingered. Her dreams were haunted by Daniel's voice, and each day felt like a test of her resolve. The mystery of the calls gnawed at her, urging her to seek answers, but the fear of what she might uncover held her back. As the days turned into weeks, Claire found herself drawn into a spiraling obsession with the calls. Each ring of the phone was a reminder of the unresolved, a call to confront the shadows of her past that she could no longer ignore. The voice continued to echo in her mind, a relentless reminder of something that was still left unsaid. The third call came with an unsettling regularity, now a grim ritual that Claire could neither escape nor predict. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of anticipation that accompanied each call, her nights haunted by the dread of hearing that familiar voice again. Each time the phone rang, she felt a chill that seemed to seep into her very bones, a prelude to the eerie conversations that awaited her. This time, Claire sat by the phone, her hands clutching the receiver with a white-knuckled grip. The room was dim, the light from the bedside lamp casting long shadows that danced eerily across the walls. Her eyes were fixed on the clock, watching the seconds tick away as she braced herself for the inevitable ring. When the call came, the static was louder than before, a harsh, crackling noise that made her flinch. She pressed the receiver to her ear, trying to block out the oppressive static that seemed to fill the entire space. The voice emerged, but it was more distorted than ever, the once familiar tones now twisted by an almost otherworldly interference. Claire, the voice was barely audible, struggling to break through the static. There was an urgent quality to it, a sense that time was running out. The words seemed to be half-formed, as if they were caught between dimensions, unable to fully manifest in the world of the living. The voice was less coherent than before, the message it carried lost in the haze of static. Claire's anxiety mounted as she tried to make sense of the fragmented utterances. There was a sense of increasing desperation in the tone, a feeling that something critical was being communicated, but the interference made it nearly impossible to grasp. Claire's mind raced with a mixture of fear and frustration. She had tried everything to understand the calls, listening intently, recording the conversations, even seeking help from various experts who dismissed her claims as the product of stress or imagination. None of their explanations fit the eerie reality of her situation. Each call left her feeling more isolated, as if the world were slipping away from her grasp. Friends and family had grown concerned, noticing the strain in her voice and the haunted look in her eyes. Yet, despite their best efforts to comfort her, Claire could not escape the relentless grip of the phone calls. The mystery of the voice consumed her thoughts, overshadowing everything else in her life. The calls were always followed by a deep silence, an empty void that seemed to mock her efforts to understand. The silence was almost worse than the calls themselves, a reminder of the unanswered questions and the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows. Claire found herself dreading the quiet moments, knowing that they were just a prelude to the next disturbing call. Determined to find answers, Claire began to investigate her brother's past more thoroughly. She pored over old family photos, letters, and any scrap of information she could find, hoping to uncover some clue that might explain the haunting calls. Yet, the deeper she delved into the past, the more elusive the answers seemed. One evening, as she sifted through a box of old family mementos, Claire found herself lost in memories of Daniel. Each photograph and letter was a reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. The pain of his loss was still fresh, despite the years that had passed. The calls seemed to dredge up that old grief, making it impossible for her to move forward. With each passing day, the calls became more frequent and more disturbing. The static seemed to intensify, and the voice grew increasingly frantic. Claire felt as though she were being drawn into a web of shadows, with each call pulling her further from the light of reason. She knew she had to confront whatever was behind the calls, but the fear of what she might find kept her paralyzed, unable to take the next step. The third call ended with the same abrupt silence, leaving Claire to grapple with the unanswered questions and the growing dread that filled her nights. The voice continued to haunt her dreams, a persistent echo of something she could not fully understand. The line between the living and the dead seemed to blur with each call, and Claire's resolve to uncover the truth only deepened as the mystery of the voice on the line drew her further into its dark embrace. As the days wore on, Claire's obsession with the calls began to consume her entire existence. Each ring of the phone was a harbinger of dread, a reminder of the unresolved mystery that had become a central part of her life. The calls had escalated in both frequency and intensity, leaving her increasingly isolated and fearful. Claire had started to notice changes in her environment, subtle but unsettling. Objects seemed to move on their own, shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, and a persistent coldness settled over her home. The sense of being watched became almost palpable, adding another layer of fear to her already fraught existence. The fourth call came in the middle of the night, as Claire lay in bed, unable to sleep. The phone rang with its usual insistent tone, slicing through the darkness of her bedroom. She hesitated for a moment before reaching for the receiver, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. When she lifted the receiver to her ear, the static was louder than ever, a cacophony of crackling noise that seemed to fill the room. The voice on the other end was almost unintelligible, lost in the overwhelming static that seemed to invade every corner of her consciousness. The urgency in the voice was undeniable, but the message was obscured, buried under layers of interference. Claire, the voice was barely discernible, a whisper lost in the static. There was a sense of desperation, an almost pleading tone that sent shivers down her spine. The fragmented words were interspersed with bursts of static, creating a disorienting and maddening effect. Claire's mind raced as she tried to piece together the distorted message. The static seemed to take on a life of its own, almost as if it were a living entity, trying to obscure the truth. The voice was more frantic than before, as if the speaker were struggling to communicate something of great importance before time ran out. The calls had begun to take a toll on Claire's mental state. She found herself growing more paranoid, her once orderly life descending into chaos. She started to question her own sanity, wondering if the voice was a product of her fractured mind. The nights were filled with restless sleep, her dreams haunted by the distorted echoes of the calls. Desperation led Claire to seek out help from a paranormal investigator. She hoped that someone with experience in dealing with the supernatural could shed light on her situation. The investigator arrived with an array of equipment, including recording devices and electromagnetic field detectors, but despite their efforts, the calls continued unabated. The investigators' attempts to communicate with the source of the calls yielded little. The static remained impenetrable, and the voice continued to be a haunting whisper in the background. The lack of tangible evidence only served to deepen Claire's despair, as she was left with the unsettling realization that the calls were defying explanation. In the weeks that followed, Claire began to isolate herself further. Her friends and family, concerned for her well-being, tried to reach out, but their efforts were met with increasingly erratic behavior. Claire's home, once a place of comfort, had become a prison of fear and uncertainty. The calls were relentless, and the voice's distorted pleas seemed to echo through every corner of her life. One particularly stormy night, as lightning illuminated the sky and thunder rumbled in the distance, Claire received another call. The atmosphere was charged with electricity, adding to the sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air. The phone rang with its usual urgency, and Claire's hand shook as she lifted the receiver. The static was deafening, a storm of noise that seemed to engulf her. The voice, when it emerged, was barely recognizable. It was a haunting, fragmented sound, filled with an intensity that bordered on the hysterical. The words were lost in the maelstrom of static, but the emotion conveyed was unmistakable. Claire listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice seemed to be trying to convey a message, but the static made it nearly impossible to decipher. The feeling of urgency was overwhelming, and Claire could sense that something significant was being communicated, though the exact nature of the message remained elusive. As the call ended, Claire was left with a profound sense of unease. The static lingered in the silence that followed, a reminder of the mystery that continued to elude her understanding. The calls had become more than just a source of fear, they were now a consuming force, driving her to the brink of her sanity. The fourth call had only deepened the mystery, leaving Claire with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread about what might come next. The fifth call arrived with a chilling predictability, its timing coinciding with the darkest hour of the night. Claire had reached a point of near despair, her once vibrant life now overshadowed by the relentless phone calls that seemed to consume every aspect of her existence. The calls had grown increasingly erratic, and the voice, though still recognizable as Daniel's, had become more frenzied, almost as if it were struggling against an unseen force. On this particular night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and adding to the ominous atmosphere that pervaded Claire's home. She sat by the phone, her nerves frayed from weeks of constant tension. The room was shrouded in darkness, with only the faint glow of the streetlight outside casting eerie shadows across the walls. When the phone rang, it was accompanied by a surge of static that seemed to echo the storm outside. Claire's heart raced as she reached for the receiver, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The static was louder than ever, a cacophony of noise that made it difficult to focus. The voice, when it finally broke through, was almost unrecognizable. Claire. Please, the words were fragmented and distorted, but the urgency in the tone was unmistakable. The static seemed to intensify, swallowing the voice in its chaotic embrace. The plea was filled with a sense of desperation that transcended words, a cry for help that seemed to pierce through the layers of interference. Claire's desperation grew as she tried to make sense of the message. The voice was more frantic than ever, the words disjointed and fragmented. The static seemed to pulsate with an almost malevolent energy, as if it were actively working against the communication. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and Claire found herself sinking deeper into a state of dread. The investigation into the paranormal continued, but the results were inconclusive. The investigator had performed numerous tests and recorded various anomalies, but nothing that could definitively explain the source of the calls. The lack of tangible evidence only fueled Claire's growing sense of isolation, as she felt increasingly disconnected from the world around her. One evening, Claire found herself reviewing old family photos and mementos, searching for any clue that might shed light on the mystery. As she looked through the faded images, she came across a photograph of Daniel taken shortly before his death. The photograph was hauntingly clear, capturing a moment of joy that seemed out of place in her current reality. In the photo, Daniel was smiling, his eyes bright and full of life. Claire's heart ached at the sight, and she was struck by the stark contrast between the vibrant figure in the photograph and the distorted voice that now haunted her nights. She wondered if there was a message hidden in the calls, something that had yet to be revealed. The calls continued with their relentless pattern, each one leaving Claire more unsettled than the last. The voice seemed to be trying to convey something important, but the static and interference made it nearly impossible to discern the exact nature of the message. The sense of urgency grew with each call, and Claire felt as though time was slipping away, leaving her with an increasing sense of foreboding. On the final night of the series of calls, the storm outside had reached a crescendo, its fury echoing the tumultuous emotions inside Claire. The phone rang with its usual insistent tone, and Claire answered it with a heavy heart. The static was almost deafening, a wall of noise that threatened to overwhelm her. The voice, when it emerged, was a haunting blend of desperation and clarity. "Claire." It's time. The words were still fragmented, but there was a distinct shift in the tone, as if the message was finally coming through with a sense of finality. The static seemed to recede slightly, allowing the words to resonate with an eerie clarity. Claire listened intently, her heart racing as she tried to grasp the significance of the message. The voice seemed to be guiding her towards something, urging her to take action. The sense of urgency was palpable, and Claire knew that whatever was behind the calls was reaching its climax. With a deep breath, Claire resolved to confront the mystery head-on. She gathered her courage and prepared to delve into the heart of the enigma that had haunted her for so long. The calls had revealed a sense of urgency, and Claire was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it might lead. As the final call ended and the static faded into silence, Claire was left with a profound sense of anticipation and dread. The voice on the line had delivered its message, and now it was up to her to decipher its meaning and face the consequences of the haunting revelation that had come from beyond the grave. The mystery was far from over, but Claire was ready to confront whatever lay ahead, driven by the echoes of a voice that had never truly left her.